My name's Ed, and I grew up in rural Devonshire, working on farms of various size and various political persuasion, I must admit, for most of my life. I now farm a 3-acre market garden on the edge of the community where I grew up, Chagford. And I also work as a journalist, researching and writing on agricultural globalisation issues. In order to discuss a new vision, kind of the title of the conference, New Vision for Food Production, I think it's important that I firstly identify what I think is wrong with the current model. We're very lucky to have with us here Colin Tudge and the other speakers this morning who did a very good job at explaining what has gone wrong with today's model of food production and how we can go about fixing it. But what I really want to talk about is the next generation, because I believe passionately that it's my generation, the next generation, who are going to be actively farming over the next 30 or 40 years, who are going to play a pivotal role really in sculpting the resilient food supply of the future. So, as I said, I grew up in rural Devon, working on mainly family-sized mixed farms, small mixed farms, essentially because that was actually I've got a picture here somewhere. Am I next? Oh, there we go. This is the landscape that I grew up in. Essentially, they're small mixed farms because that was the type of farming that had evolved to make the most of the small fields and the rolling hills of the landscape. Cereals and sometimes root crops were grown on the flattest ground. Hay was cut on the meadows in the summer, and in between livestock, beef and dairy cows were grazed on the steepest ground in the marginal land. In this way, these small farms of essentially less than 100 acres were able to support a farming family. So that was a farmer, one or two of his children, as well as several local labourers, like myself. The farm system itself was essentially closed in that the manure from the livestock was used to fertilise the fields, and the cereals and root crops used to feed and bed the livestock during the winter. Now, this wasn't that long ago. I'm not that old. It was in the mid-1990s, in fact. But it was around the time of the McSharry reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy. And importantly, what the McSharry reforms did was brought UK and European agriculture in line. I'll just stick on that slide for a minute. In line with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was the forerunner to the World Trade Organization. And what I didn't realise at the time, but what's become brutally obvious to me since, was that what I was seeing was really the last glimpse of a sustainable rural livelihood that had supported my landscape and my community for generations beforehand. Within the space of a few years, since the mid-90s really, many of the farms around the area, their incomes halved as they were forced to compete with cereal producers in Minnesota or milk producers in Brazil. Many of those farms that had previously been fiercely proud of their financial self-sufficiency finally had to bite the bullet and accept the incentives being offered by the CAP to turn over half their ground to oilseed rape or adopt a Holstein Friesian herd, milking herd, simply in order to support a single wage on their farms. For me personally, and many of my friends, the most immediate impact of this was that we could no longer find work on local farms, regular employment on local farms. In fact, the children of farming families that I grew up with, they could no longer count on a livelihood in the farm once they left school. Many of them retrained as mechanics, estate agents or hairdressers, and some of the most passionate ones went to agricultural college, but obviously with no guarantee of an income when they finished their courses. Now, this was only 15 years ago. At that point, there was 102,000 people employed in full-time in producing food in the UK. Today, that figure's dropped to just over 66,000. And if the statistics are to be believed, the average holding is now 140 acres, supports a single wage, and the average farmer in the UK is now nearing 60 years old. So it kind of begs the question, really, what's changed? Now, we're not eating less food. In fact, we're feeding a growing population, and we're throwing away more food than ever before. What we are doing, however, is importing more food from elsewhere than we have done at any point in history. According to Tim Lang at City University's Centre for Food Policy, 40% of what's available on our supermarket shelves is imported or produced somewhere else, somewhere where the costs of production are appreciably lower, but arguably the costs to rural workers and the environment is arguably a lot higher. Now, here we reach a difference of opinion. If you speak, as I do regularly as a journalist, to the heads of agribusiness or government ministers or large-scale farmers or commodity traders, you get the impression that Intensive production coupled with global trade is the only blueprint we have for the challenge of feeding 9 billion people by 2050. If, on the other hand, you speak to economists such as Vandana Shiva or Raj Patel, or for that matter, plantation workers in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean or Latin America, those people who are producing the food, much of the food that arrives on our supermarket shelves, I've come to the conclusion that the current model that we have doesn't have the social, economic or biological foundations to support today's population, let alone an additional 3 billion people over the next 50 years. So within the last couple of years, we've seen an unprecedented increase in food prices in the UK, 15% on average across the board. Although there's many factors driving this trend, and many of them have been mentioned this morning, there's almost universal consensus that one of the primary factors is the increasing cost of oil and the accumulated cost of our dependence upon oil along the food supply chain. I think it's kind of nearing the time when we have to accept that if this is going to carry on, oil is a finite resource, and the oil price seems to be going only in one direction. Now seems to be as important time as any to ask, where's this next generation of young farmers going to come from, and what are the new models of food production going to be that we're going to use to feed a growing population over the next 30 or 40 years? So I just want to talk briefly about my reaction to that challenge and how I've gone about addressing it over the last couple of years. After having watched many of the young people in my community leave in search of work or affordable housing over the last decade or so, I made the decision a couple of years ago to attempt to create a livelihood for myself within my local community using the skills that I'd learnt through working on other people's farms. We held a community meeting, an initial community meeting, which brought together a wide cross-section of the community from residents, businesses, landowners and local farmers. And at that meeting there was a strong consensus that Chagford, as an agricultural community, really needed to act to shorten the distance between producers and consumers. There was lots of beef, lamb, dairy producers around the town who were selling their produce elsewhere, but it was very difficult for them to market in the town. And also there wasn't any vegetables being produced within a 25-mile radius. So my initial proposal was to create a market garden to feed. We had a target of feeding 80 to 100 local households with a seasonal supply of fresh, affordable and ecologically produced vegetables. Importantly, what we wanted to do was to demonstrate actively demonstrate an alternative to the more industrial model of food production that had kind of eroded our community, our agricultural community for the preceding decades, really. We were keen to produce our vegetables in a way which demonstrated responsible resource use and actively improved the health of our soil. We wanted to maintain and encourage traditional farming skills, and also to demonstrate that a livelihood could be supported on much less than 140 acres. And importantly, we wanted to give our customers, residents of Chagford, the opportunity to become a lot more connected to where their food was coming from. There's a few pictures here. So, having visited a number of large and small other farms up and down the country, practicing what Colin would term enlightened agriculture, we came to the decision that community-supported agriculture was kind of the model that most suited what we wanted to achieve. Now, community-supported agriculture, or CSA, is a relatively new model here in the UK. It's a lot bigger in the States and elsewhere in Europe. But it's a model of subscription farming where customers become members of the farm, members of a scheme, and commit to buy a share of the year's produce for a year in advance. Now, this commitment does two things primarily. Firstly, for us, the farmers, it gives us the security of a guaranteed income, meaning that we don't have to rely on fertilizers, pesticides or herbicides in order to offset losses. We're able to adopt a much more ecological, low-impact approach to farming. And for the consumer, our members become much more actively involved in where their food's coming from, how it's produced, and the people who are producing it. Our members also accept that they're actually sharing in the risks and rewards of farming, meaning that if it's we get a bumper harvest, they share in a bumper harvest of that crop. But if we get a crop loss, then they also accept that they're sharing the loss between them, and that's part of their experience of the farming enterprise. We hold a work day on the farm once a month, open to members and also the general public, And it's an opportunity really for Chagford residents to get directly involved in the locality or seasonal growing tasks such as sowing, planting out, weeding, hedge laying, scything, dry stone walling. And from the feedback we've had, it suggests our members value this as an opportunity to directly experience firsthand the locality, the weather conditions, and the labour that's involved in bringing the food to their plates. This is obviously something you don't get at the supermarket. After having secured a 1 acre site, that first slide was of our site, we were very fortunate to get funding from the Big Lottery Fund's local food programme back in 2009 to get the scheme off the ground. It was an initial grant to subsidise the setup of the scheme. What was less easy to get was planning permission from the National Park for the polytunnels and sheds we needed for the infrastructure for the site. We finally managed to get that last March. We launched the scheme later in the spring, and last season we supplied 27 local households over a 40-week period. We've just taken on another 2 acres of land, and from mid-June this year we'll be supplying 45 local households with weekly veg box. On our commitment to demonstrate responsible resource use, we use organic management practices such as green manures to build fertility, physical barriers and crop rotations to control pests and disease. We use only organic certified seed and certified compost, and we actively encourage biodiversity on our fields. We are farming in a way that would be classed as organic, but we don't need to be certified as organic due to the transparency of the scheme. Our members, all of our members who get our produce, come to the field regularly, and they can see for themselves how their food is produced. So that's a cost that we don't have to bear in terms of certification. Instead, we're certified with something called the Wholesome Food Association, who is a small-scale alternative, and they adhere to a peer-reviewed inspection process. So we have a farmer coming to visit our site once a year, and we go and visit someone else's. We rely on our workhorse, Samson, for the majority of the tilling and cultivation on our field. This is obviously part of our commitment to responsible resource use, but it's also, importantly, for me, the main reason I'm using a working horse is to demonstrate that traditional farming skills still have a relevant role to play in food production in the 21st century. We're the only farm in the UK so far to be using the Cassine cultivator, which is designed by a French peasant farming cooperative, Promata. The Cassine is a kind of modern adaptation of traditional French farming tool. And it's a prime example of how modern technology can be combined with traditional draft power in an efficient farming enterprise. We recently ran a 3-day course on the use of the Cassine and working horses in market gardens, and intend to run 2 courses a year from now on the farm. In terms of demonstrating a sustainable rural livelihood, Chagfood currently supports 2 part-time growers, myself and another lass, Chinny. We're employed part-time. While the scheme is still partly funded through the initial setup grant, we anticipate that once we're supplying 80 boxes a week, which we aim to be doing by next spring, the scheme will be financially self-sufficient, and at that point we'll be supporting 2 full-time wages on just under 3 acres of ground. So, although at the moment we're totally and utterly immersed in the day-to-day running of a market garden this size, we are aware that we're part of a much bigger picture. We're not alone in our desire as young people to want to get back onto the land. Over the last couple of years, I've also been involved in setting up a European-wide movement or network of young people who are active or determined to get back into farming and pursue a livelihood in agriculture. Under the banner of Reclaim the Fields, we first met in the European Social Forum in Malmö, Sweden, in 2008, then again at Via Campesina's International Conference that year. We've since had international youth camps throughout Europe every year since then. Reclaim the Fields says, importantly, it's given young people across Europe the confidence that they're not alone in their desire to want to get into farming when it seems like a dying industry. You know, young people wanting to get into farming is not unheard of. It just doesn't get much press. Importantly, it also gives young people the confidence they're not alone in the obstacles that they face along the way. Many of the problems that we have with young people trying to get into farming in the UK are replicated across Europe. And if we can find ways of getting around these problems and getting ourselves onto the land, then we can share these experiences across Europe and help other people do the same. Importantly, what Reclaim the Fields has done for the first time is brought together urban permaculturalists and activists who have experience in political campaigning with rural youngsters who have experience in farming, but not necessarily the skills to politicise their struggle to get back onto the land. Since our first meeting 4 years ago, RTF has grown from a mailing list to coordinated national groups, to an international gathering, an annual international gathering now, and more recently a network of small farms offering skill sharing in accessing land, accessing capital, and actively learning how to farm. RTF as a movement, as the name suggests, Reclaim the Fields, is also keen on direct action, and the movement has occupied and cultivated several sites across Europe over the past couple of years to raise awareness of the problems facing young people. The UK constellation or group of Reclaim the Fields held its first meeting in March this year, and we're planning another meeting in the autumn with the Land is Ours collective, and the International Youth Camp for Reclaim the Fields is taking place this September in Western Romania, and it will be attended by more than 400 young farmers and activists from across Europe. So, as I said before, I believe personally the next sort of 30 to 40 years is going to be pivotal in the struggle really to create the resilient food supply of the future, and I believe that it's our generation, those of us getting into farming now, my generation, who are going to be at the front lines of that struggle. Despite my optimistic outlook that what we've seen with recent food price inflation is the beginning of the end of industrial globalised agriculture, the fact is that the battle's only really just begun. It's only over the next decade, as food price inflation really starts to bite, that the agribusiness and supermarkets are really going to come out fighting for their own survival. And I think it's at this time, more than any other, that we need to demonstrate that, that small, mixed, diverse family farms represent an alternative, represent an ideal to work towards, and that we have the young people willing to pursue a life on the land. That's it for now.